Good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to the Pan-African Activist Sunday School. I'd like to introduce myself and also my co-convener. My name is Crystal Strong. I am a core organizer with Black Lives Matter Philadelphia.
Hi everyone, my name is Nanre. I'm an organizer with Afro-Socialist Caucus, and I'm also an organizer with Links Nigeria, Linking Youth of Nigeria 15.
So we should tell you just a bit about the idea of the Pan-African Activist Sunday School. Do you want to start us off, Nanre?
Yeah, sure. So the idea, so Crystal and I have been working on, various things concerning, we're both activists and have covered social movements both here in the United States and also in Nigeria, and have lived in both countries, being from both countries between the two of us. And so when a lot of our ideas converged when the End SARS protest started, and we reached out to each other and reached out to a lot of friends and thought about what kinds of contributions can we make to the current movement, the current iteration of a social movement in Nigeria. And so we began a series of conversations with fellow activists, both in the United States and in Nigeria. And we started a group, a solidarity network group, to continue these conversations. And out of the series of conversations, we thought what would be most useful is, and what maybe was a gap that was not being filled, was activists from different countries being able to talk to each other, to be able to learn from each other, to be able to learn both from past movements and organizing, and also with current movements that are currently ongoing. So learning strategies, learning structure, but also providing sources of encouragement and also solidarity between different countries, but ways in which we can really build a strong network between Black and African organizers globally. And so we came up with this idea for the series of Sunday schools, which are ways in which we can both encourage. It was originally just designed to encourage Nigerian activists. This was even before the harsh crackdown on protesters. But it became more of a conversation which is going broader into organizers learning from each other. So the Nigerian activists bringing things to the table, and activists from other countries also bringing their learning experiences to the table.
I think another thing to just highlight here is the emphasis on Pan-Africanism. We both have been embedded within organizing work, movement work across the Atlantic. We've also studied these phenomenon, and we are very aware of the fact that there are global Pan-African struggles that are happening right now, many of which share a number of connections with one another. If we look at, for example, hashtag end SARS and how it is bringing up the fact that the struggle around police and ending police brutality against Black people, it is not simply a struggle that is happening in the US or in the West. It is a global struggle. And so when we are able to see these connections, when we are able to connect with one another, we are actually stronger. And in fact, we are following within a historic tradition of African people all around the world, which was not just recognizing that we are all African people, we are all people of African descent, but that if we want to win in each of our struggles, we have a much better chance of doing that when we are learning from one another, when we are connected to one another, and when we are able to stand in solidarity with one another. And so these are some of the politics that are really driving and informing why we thought it valuable to form the Pan-African Activist Sunday School. And we're so glad that you decided to tune in with us this afternoon or evening, depending where you are. Should we introduce all of the wonderful organizers that are here to contribute to this conversation? That was a rhetorical question.
There we are. So it's such an honor to be here in the midst of great organizers that have been organizing for decades, as well as organizers who are just coming up into the ranks, and such a beautiful time to be here in this intergenerational conversation. I can just start, and maybe you can wave your hand if I'll try to go around the clock as such. Um, So starting off in the corner beside me is Tunde Osazwa, and he's the coordinator of the U.S. Out of Africa Network, which is the organizing arm of Black Alliance for Peace and the U.S. Out of Africa and Shut Down AFRICOM campaign. Over in the next corner with the orange cap is one of our senior comrades and activists. He doesn't like for me to say senior, but Baba Aye has been organizing for decades under various social movements with the Socialist Workers and Youth League in Nigeria, and is currently the co-convener of the Coalition for Revolution in Nigeria. In the next, over here in the middle is Lengdang, and Lengdang Tunchama is the Director of Data and Research at the Gentle Reads Community Initiative, which is in Jos Plateau State, and he's been organizing and part of some of the movements over there in Jos. And next to Lengdang is Tabia Princewell, and she is a journalist and public policy analyst with a wealth of experience in the public sector and at the state and federal levels in Nigeria. And over in the corner is another one of our activists that has been serving for decades also in Nigeria. She's an active, Ngozi Iweare is an activist for social justice with rich experience in the student movement, the feminist movement, and the pro-democracy movement. She's a grassroots community organizer, and she founded and leads the nonprofit Community Life Project, the CLP, and Reclaim Nigeria, which is a grassroots movement for social accountability. And finally, in the last corner is Buki Shonibare, and she's the executive director of Invictus Africa. She's a consultant on human rights and a human rights advocate focusing on promoting the rights of vulnerable and disadvantaged persons. Buki is a Mandela Washington Fellow, a Commonwealth Scholar, and she's also one of the key organizers of the Bring Back Our Girls movement and has been organizing on that front also for the past 6 years. So I think that's everyone. Welcome everyone to this space. Thanks for being here and for giving us your time. And we look forward to learning from you and from all the wisdom that you have to share with us today.
Absolutely. As everyone watching can see, we have a wealth of organizing experience on this panel. We have a wealth of organizing across different iterations of struggle. And so you are in for a great amount of learning today, and we hope that you comment wherever you are. If you're tuning in from Facebook, if you're tuning in from Twitter, if you're tuning in from YouTube, please ask comments. We will have a portion at the end in which you'll be able to ask questions as well, but please keep the conversation going in the comments, and we may highlight your comment as the conversation goes along. So just to get us started and give you a sense of how our conversation today is going to be structured, we're going to start with a real deep dive into both SARS and also the history of activism in Nigeria. Since it was the SARS struggle that brought us all together, we thought it was fitting that we start there as we move across global Pan-African struggles. So after we hear from a few of our panelists about understanding what happened most recently in the past weeks and months in Nigeria, we will also talk about some larger histories of activism in Nigeria. We will then have some time to really dig into and explore Pan-African connections that SARS and histories of activism brings up. And then we will also have a great amount of time to dig into questions and comments that comes from our audience. So we hope you are ready to get started.
Yes, so thank you so much, everyone. And so I'm just going to start with a very brief introduction about what's going on in Nigeria. I know that we're speaking to people and having a conversation with people from around the world. And as we all know, this has been on the news for the last few weeks. But SARS is really part of a much longer history of social struggle in Nigeria. And that's one of the reasons why we brought different activists into the house today, to the table, to really learn from how this current iteration of a social movement is actually a continuation of a much larger very rich history of activism and advocacy in Nigeria across decades. So what's been happening, I'm just going to speak just for a few minutes to give a brief background of this current iteration of the struggle. And so what is SARS? So SARS is the Federal Special Anti-Robbery Squad, and it's a special tactical unit, a police unit in Nigeria. It was set up in 1992, and it's kind of what the Guardian calls a faceless security force. So it's a specialized squad, but it also became a very dangerous squad, much like many of the squads that we see across the world, who are special, but they're also very dangerous. So the End SARS movement. So the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, SARS, became very notorious for extrajudicial killings, murders, brutal beatings, known for picking up people, arresting them, taking them to ATM machines, harassing women, raping women. So it became a very, very dangerous and deadly presence in Nigeria, but was also a representation of a larger problem with policing and with the army in the country, and these very brutal tactics that have been used across the country for decades, moving from military rule into civilian rule. So at the beginning, the End SARS movement emerged, this particular iteration of the movement, which took place over the last 2 months, began in October when police footage of 2 policemen murdering as 2 civilians emerged on the internet, and this went viral. And unlike much like many videos that have gone viral in the United States and across the world, this particular video really caught on, and many people reposted it, and there began an online protest that was titled End SARS. But this movement also really took hold on the streets. And before, in the first week of October, by the time it was 1 week into the first tweet, millions of people had gathered in the streets across Nigeria, from Lagos to Abuja, to Enugu, to Jos, Kano, Kaduna, Onitsha. There were protests everywhere. There were also global protests across the world: Toronto, Leeds, London, Geneva, DC. There were protests everywhere. And funds were raised by protesters. Protesters fed each other. They took care of each other. They held concerts and vigils on the streets. And the hashtag EndSARS became a local cry for the world to put an eye on what has been happening in Nigeria and how many young people had been suffering at the hands of this brutal tactical force. So this caught the attention of the world and also brought celebrities from around the world to speak to the End SARS movement and the cause. And many celebrities, especially those in the US and in the UK, advocated and joined their voices to tweet and to speak to the movement to end SARS. The protest really resonated with anti-police protests around the world, especially after a long summer of protests in the United States and globally, which has brought attention to Black lives and how they are targeted by the police, and how Black men and women, children and young people are brutally killed, maimed and affected by police. So while all this was happening, the movement grew over 2 weeks of protests in the streets, which was really seen as a very unique moment in the history of Nigeria, because it was a very young movement. The youth of Nigeria really took to the streets and really made their voices known that they were not going to take what was happening. However, in the 3rd week of the protest, the government took a brutal turn on protesters. Even though killings had occurred throughout the weeks of the protest, there was a very violent crackdown, which was emphasized and which catalyzed on October 20th, a night which most young Nigerians will never forget. Many young Nigerians watched on Instagram Live and later through tweets and videos and WhatsApp footage where the army turned on the protesters and began shooting and killing protesters for over 6 hours. The figures that are official with Amnesty International and other bodies are around 58, but the exact toll of protesters that were killed on that day is yet to be known, because a lot of the bodies were not found, and many of the bodies apparently were claimed by the government itself. So after what happened after October 20th? Well, a lot of the protests on the streets were quelled. There was a long silence because many activists were scared, and this was rightly so. Since that time, activists have been targeted. They have been targeted, and their bank accounts have been closed. Some have been stopped at the border. Others have been threatened. Some have left the country out of fear of their lives. And also, there's been a huge crackdown. The government has arrested protesters. They've also taken They've also been investigating, and even today there were new calls for investigations into journalists. Different TV stations like Arise TV and other TV stations have all been questioned and queried by the government, and there's a harsh crackdown on protesters and on activists that is currently ongoing in the country. I would like to keep my statements brief there because we have so much to learn from activists that have organized over the decades. And we really want to learn from them about not just their views about the End SARS movement, but out of all the rich organizing experiences, what can we learn from the different social movements in the country, and how can we use that to move from protest to movement, which is the theme of our series. So I'll hand back over to Crystal, and I think actually I'll hand back over to the first speaker, which is Comrade Babaye.
Thank you very much, Nanre. I'll be speaking on activism and police brutality, and I want to start by pointing out that that statement you often see in the police station in Nigeria, that the police is your friend, is a lie. And the belief that the police force is meant to quell crime and make life safer is also not true. The police generally they are the first line of repression of the ruling class of elites. And the particular way and manner that this is shaped, it reflects how capitalism develops. I mean, like in the United States, the police emerged as ne'er-do-wells that captured enslaved blacks that escaped and returned them to their slave masters. And in Nigeria, it started as a colonial force in 1920. Well, after several more localized, like constabularies. But the long and short is that it has been an institution of repression in different ways over the years. The politicians have used this. Even during the colonial era, the police served both the colonial masters and their local collaborators, which were the chiefs. They were also quite beholden to the native authorities. And for a long time, police brutality, although general, was much more associated with politicking, where different political parties in power of the elites, of course, use this to repress attempts at getting genuine democracy and transparent electoral pursuits. But with SARS, I wouldn't want to talk much on SARS. I think Nari has done a great beat on that. I just want to point out that the manner in which SARS now became to personify police brutality reflected the way neoliberalism further worsened the lives of the generality of people, particularly the youth. You know, with increasing unemployment when after the structural adjustment program was introduced in the mid-80s and all that. I mean, this was what partly resulted in the issue of crime being on the rise and all that. But now, before looking at activism in general, I want to also say that whilst we point out that the institution of the police is a means of repression, and I mean the police is not your friend, this is not to say that it is impossible to win over elements of these repressive forces. And I'm talking from some practical experiences over the years. Like in 1989, the anti-SARP revolt had been the largest, the most generalized fight back since independence in 1960. It's also instructive to point out that this was sparked by the youths, in that case, the National Association of Nigerian Students. Over 100 people were killed eventually on the 31st of May, May 31st, which we dubbed Black Wednesday, and from which the Socialist Workers' League got its name in its first incarnation. It was then known as the May 31st movement. But it could have been much more if some units of the police had not told us where, I mean, not to go, where killer squad. And another very important bit in looking at the police and activism was the police strike of 2002. The police went on strike and they won some concessions. But part of the yet to be documented part of this story is that it did not just happen. The main driving force behind this police strike was Teslim Oyekomi, a member of the May 31st movement at the time. And dozens of police were killed silently. And to the death, they did not betray him. They did not make his name available. I mean, we can mention his own name now, partly because we lost Teslim, better known as Samori, on the 1st of October 10 years ago. But now, more generally with regards to activism in the country, is that you have had a long history of youth and working class activism. I would say mainly from the 1940s. It was the working class struggle with the most emblematic phenomenon of this being the 1945 general strike, which lasted for over 50 days, were the main driving force that convinced the colonial masters that, look, it was time for them to pack their luggage and go, pack their baggage and go. And also with this, you had the youth movement, the Zikist National Vanguard, which played a key role in this. But by the 1950s, the local elite, even before independence, having been assured that, look, they will be given the role of the junior partners in a post-colonial Nigeria. That is to say that flag independence was imminent. They abandoned the working class. They vilified the youth. You know, they came out even before fully taking power. They supported they supported legislation of the colonial masters, including to ban revolutionary and radical literature. So it had been an uphill task. But the working class and youth activists had consistently, through the 60s and 70s, these were in a sense the heydays of, so that was when you had the largest revolutionary party until recently, and definitely the largest Marxist-Leninist party or socialist party in the history of the country. This was the Socialist Workers and Farmers Party, which was established in 1963. But it was hounded, especially after the military came into power in 1966. To a great extent, activism in Nigeria was against military dictatorship. You know, in several points in the history of the country. The most trenchant of these was in the 1980s and 1990s, when you had the Campaign for Democracy at first, and then several other bodies, the United Action for Democracy, waged relentless battles against military dictatorship, especially after the military annulled the June 12 elections in 1993. And that was when you had a mass movement. I would say I wrote somewhere else that 6 years of revolution and counter-revolution. And people put their lives on the line. I mean, liberty and limb, a lot. On July 7, 1993, when you had the first act of those 6 years of intense struggle, over 100 people also were killed on the streets by the police and the army. But that did not stop resistance. That did not stop resistance. A key aspect of activism then was political education, consistent political education. But gradually from 1989, 91, I mean, talking here of the collapse of the Berlin Wall and then the eradication of what was the Soviet Union, there was a relative de-ideologization of activist politics and the rise more of NGOization. This is not to say that you don't have NGOs doing good stuff, even political education to a large extent, but it was also that most of the left groups either collapsed, you know, or the politics became something different from what it was. And that was also when you had some extent of ethnicization of the politics of some of the groups on the left. These all had impact. And I'm trying to sum up now. I want to show how it links to now. How does it link to now? Is that always commend the young activists of this current generation. And why do I say so? Even before NSAS, often when a lot of comrades from earlier times write off activists and activism, particularly in the student movement, but in the youth movement, I always point out something. To a great extent, at least for most of these young activists, they were born political orphans. Earlier generations always had people to look up to. They always had, there were traditions. But the current generation and that partly explains the influence of the expansive influence, so to speak, of liberal views within the recent movement. And that is also why what the Coalition for Revolution is doing is of utmost importance, because it is bridging not only traditions of the past and the present, but pointing out quite clearly that, look, we need total liberation, and without system change, if we win reforms today, whatever the state gives with with one hand, it will take with the other. It is not enough just to fight to roll back this or that. Yes, we need to fight and defend reforms that we win, but we should not think that our total liberation can come through just a gradual, reform upon reform. In short, reformism. And that is why it is not just about electoral politics. There are affiliates of CORE like the African Action Congress that are also political parties contesting for offices. But just as Babangida, one of the military head of states in the 1980s up to 93, pointed out, he said something that should give an inkling to people. He said that we are not only in office, we are in power. What that means, it is possible for a political power party to be in office without being in power. And that is what happens where radical forces see the electoral pathway as the primary way of winning power. The primary way of winning power of working class people by working class people for working class people and youth is on the streets. It's through revolution. It's by upturning the nonsensical, obsolete system of capitalism through a series of political revolutions. And that is our aim. That is our focus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Babaye. So much rich knowledge, so much history that you just wrapped up in so few minutes. Really so much to learn. And you can also read Comrade Bright's extensively. And if you just look up his name and you want to read anything that is current and about this, you can find so many of his articles all over. So moving into thank you so much. And moving on to the next speaker. And we will also, please, if you have questions and comments for Babaye, you can just post them right now in the comments section, and we will keep those. And there will be a time later on in the program where he will answer questions, and all the other panelists will also answer your questions. So please chat them in the comments section, whether you're on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. We can see all your comments, and we're reading those right now. So I'm going to hand over to another great longtime activist and organizer, Ngozi Iweari. Thank you. Welcome to this space again.
Thank you, Nare. I'm just going to briefly share my experience, and I'm going to be reiterating, some of the things that Babaye has pointed out from my experience. I personally came into the movement and the struggle, as we called it in those days, in the 70s and 80s, and then going forward. I think that one of the things that one witnessed on the scene is the fact that the movements that we had then and the protests were very ideological. They were ideologically grounded, and they were dealing with issues that have to do with what kind of country that we wanted to see. There were specific issues like issues of police brutality, the coercive forces of the state, coup d'etats, for those of us in Nigeria, for instance. But a lot of the struggles we faced were dealing with broad issues, and they were very Pan-Africanist. I think in that generation, one of the major issues was the question of decolonizing the rest of Africa, because after the independence wave that we saw in the 50s and 60s, we had the whole of Southern Africa, the large part of Southern Africa still under colonial rule, and of course, white racist rule in South Africa. So the movements that the student movements and the trade unions on the continent were very, very much Pan-Africanist, anti-apartheid, and of course, anti-colonial rule. And because of what people call the Cold War, or the great ideological divide between the communist and socialist bloc countries and the rest of the Western capitalist countries, the struggles were also internationalized. So it has a huge international dimension, with the socialist bloc supporting the decolonization of Africa. So that was what was going on, the wave of kind of struggles and protests and movements that we had. And they took different forms. They involved street protests, boycotts, including sports boycotts. People pushed to boycott South Africa, for instance, in international sports. There were pressures for governments to apply sanctions, against the white regime. So actions took place on the diplomatic scene, and there was a great deal of international solidarity. Even the women's movement, the struggles of the women movements were dealing with larger issues of state power and how that state power was being exercised, whether it was in favor of the citizens or the internal colonizing force. Because one of the things that happened in some of our countries is that when the white colonialists left, they were replaced by African colonialists that took over from them. The women's movement, for instance, women in Nigeria, when we started the women in Nigeria struggle, we already had radical women that had challenged British colonialism, challenged the structures of oppression at the community level. Those movements were also nationwide, national, and they cut across ethnic divides, regional divides, and they were also international in nature. Some of us may have heard about the Aba women's struggle, or the struggles led by Fumilayo Ransome Kuti that resulted in the sacking of one of the traditional chieftaincy seats in the West. But women in Nigeria, when we came up, were very ideological. We challenged patriarchy and not just the subordinate status of women. And there was a great deal of the work we did involved a lot of research, a lot of study, a lot of documentation, and networking. Now, linking with what is happening now, I think that for me, the whole issue of social media and the contribution of social media to this generation of activists and those who are struggling to bring about social justice in society. I think that is something that is a great tool for organizing, across boundaries that we didn't have in our own generation. But at the same time, how rooted this generation is in terms of knowing its history, okay, knowing the history, knowing how grounded they are in terms of ideological grounding. I think that it's something to interrogate. What are the lessons for me? I think I've learned over the years that movements are not an end in themselves. If we look at what became of African countries, how far we are from the kinds of country that we had aspiration for, we'll find that movements are not an end. I learned movements are not an end in itself. It is very important to articulate the end goal of the movement. What does the movement want to see? What is the alternative vision? I'm not sure that enough work is being done, enough attention is being paid to what is the alternative vision of society. I always tell myself that what something that is missing is that I have a dream path. That I have a dream path. What is the world that we are dreaming for? What do we want to see? If we ended SARS, for instance, what did we want to replace it with? And is it just about that? Because people started to raise other issues. So some of the things we are dealing with are very structural. I think that in general, looking globally, there seems to be a decline in visionary leadership. That visionary leadership that is very articulate and that gives people something to aspire to. The other thing that has come out is the disconnect, the classism. I'll call it classism. The disconnect between the elite citizens and the grassroots citizens, and we saw that also play out in the SARS movement. That you have two youth that seem to operate in two different worlds. Those that are at the grassroots on the streets that are completely cut off from the internet or the kind of education that their counterparts in the elite classes are. So there will be need to think about how to bridge that gap, that disconnect between the elite and the grassroots. I also think that was a problem for us in our generation, the ability to have grounded ourselves in mass movements that were strong enough to tip the balance in favor of changing the oppressive structures of society. So putting inequality on the agenda of the movements we are doing and looking at the big picture of what type of society, what is the new society, what is the new humanity, what is the new Africa that we want to see. So I think I'm going to stop here because I don't want to extend my time. There is so much to say, but maybe when we come back to the discussion side, I will say some of the other things I would like to share. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ngozi, and just making those incredible connections across time and also looking at really those class differences and also really strong message. Thank you so much about what is the Nigeria that we want to see, what is the Africa that we want to see, what is the world that we want to see is so important. In your question about like what are the alternatives when we're asking to remove this current structure, what is the alternative that we envision? And thanks so much for pushing those questions back to us to continue to ask ourselves these very important questions as we move forward in this current iteration of struggle, as you say, struggle, definitely. Thank you so much. So moving into our last speaker, and then we're going to go into some questions from that we have. And the next speaker is Buki Shonibari, and I've also enjoyed organizing and getting to know her over the last few years. And over to you, Buki.
Hello, everyone. Um, it's good to be here. Thank you so much for having me on this particular program. I'm just going to share experience based on what we did with Bring Back Our Girls. And that's basically going to be focused on something that I developed I think 4 years ago, what I call the advocacy life cycle. So I'm just going to share my screen. But basically, what it is about in terms of um, um, advocacy for us at Bring Back Our Girls was the fact that we had to um,
Crystal, you're muted.
Unmuting is a very helpful thing to do. Thank you for that. I was just saying that it appears that we've lost Buki for a moment. And so while we are waiting for her to come back, how about we take a look at some of the comments that have come in the chat so far. So let's see here. We had Sister Santua, who is based here in where I am anyway, in Philadelphia, reminded us that today is the 22nd anniversary of the death of Kwame Ture, some of whom you may know as Stokely Carmichael, who is a beloved and incredibly important Pan-African revolutionary. So let's lift the anniversary of his passing up. We also have some comments. There was a question asking whether or not this broadcast would be archived, and yes, it will be. So if you're watching on Facebook, if you're watching on YouTube, if you're watching on Twitter, you will be able to watch it again at a later time. It'll be archived on that platform. And I think, yes, Buki has returned. So let's have her back, and we will.
I apologize. I apologize. I was actually trying to share my screen, and I guess I got things mixed up. So I'm not sure I will be able to share my screen, but I would just speak to what I have learned so far and what I put together, and I could share that with us, before we finish. And what I call the advocacy life cycle. And with the advocacy life cycle, it spins into every lesson that I learned while we were on the Bring Back Our Girls movement. And those lessons were hinged on the fact that we needed, in a way, to be able to design something that makes sense, but most importantly, something that guides what we were trying to achieve as a movement. For me, getting into advocacy, Bring Back Our Girls was my first major experience, even though I had been involved in few other advocacies before then. But what the Bring Back Our Girls did for me was to help me understand advocacy, in a bigger light, something more than what I had already, I had not envisaged before. And it has been a huge learning experience. So in terms of the advocacy life cycle, there are actually 6 different stages of that life cycle. First is the point 0, which is basically the point where we gain insight. And that's the insight into getting a better understanding of what the issues were. And for us at Bring Back Our Girls, gathering accurate and deep understanding of the issue involved we talking to the members of the community. We had to talk to Chibok community. We had to talk to parents of the Chibok girls, relatives, friends. We had to gather information as much as we could just to be able to have a better understanding or insight into what was going on. Girls had been abducted, and for those of us that followed what happened then, we knew that the first reaction of the government at the time was a denial of that particular abduction. So people were wondering whether indeed that abduction took place. And so because of that doubt, there was then concern as to indeed whether girls had been abducted. And that doubt that was created in the minds of the people then tend to affect the reaction that people had to that particular issue, reaction around whether they were going to get on the issue or not, including me. But then 2 days after the abduction, parents of the Chibok girls came out to say our girls had been abducted and they had not been brought back. So what that did for us was to help us then gain insight into the fact that indeed, according to these people, their girls had been abducted, but they had not been brought back. So we had to gather information. There was a database, pictures, names, number of girls. There was a presidential fact-finding committee that was sent into Chibok to go and gather information. So pictures were submitted. The number of 57 girls that escaped was also submitted. So the advantage of that, of gaining that insight, is the humanization. You must sort of humanizing the fact that indeed these girls had been missing. And the importance of that is sometimes when things happen and there is need for advocacy, if we don't have faces to it, if we are unable to see and ascertain that indeed there are human beings somewhere that have been abducted or taken or something, if we can't place human faces to it, it makes it difficult for people to be able to connect emotionally. And once we can't get that emotional connection, people just see it as something happening far there in the Northeast. So the first aspect for us was to gain the insight. The second was to futurize. So in terms of futurization for us, what became necessary was for us to be able to determine what the future would look like. Should action be taken regarding the insight that we have gained? And for us at Bring Back Our Girls, the future for us was first the girls coming back. But beyond the fact that the girls coming back, the future was also the fact that, and this future is not some far distant future, it was a not too distant future. It could be tomorrow, next month. In fact, we did not envisage that 6 years or 7 years after, we would still be talking about the Chibok girls, the fact that 112 of them are still yet to be brought back. So futurization for us then meant we having a picture of the future and understanding that it is not just the fact that the girls will be brought back, but importantly, the fact that schools must then become safer. We must not have a repeat of the abduction of girls, not just in that number, but at all. And you know, so that future also included the care for those that have been affected, internally displaced persons, the parents, psychosocial support, their resocialization by the time they return, and all of that. The third, having then pictured what the future would be from the insights that we have gained, was then for us to design. And so for design, we thought that we should design what our advocacy approach would be. So right from the very first march that we had on April 30th, 2014, when we returned back to the Unity Fountain, even though the rain had died down at that time, but it became necessary for us to say that one march was not going to yield the result or the future that we had envisaged, that it was important for us to be able to have a holistic design. So we decided on that day that we're going to come back to the Unity Fountain on May the 1st, 2014, which happens to be every May the 1st is a public holiday. So in that design, we then started working on what our tactics would be, what the approach would be, what the strategy would be, who are we going to engage, what sort of engagement approach do we want to use? Do we want to protest? Do we want to do sit at the table conversations? It wasn't our engagement with the duty bearers was not just protest. We were not just marching on the street. We were having indoor meetings. We were having high-level meetings, both nationally and internationally. So the design of our advocacy strategy included creating alliances, partnerships, both nationally and internationally, with design tactics around the use of social media, even though I must admit that what happened with social media as it relates to Bring Back Our Girls was almost like a natural occurrence. It wasn't like we had all of the tactics planned out, but I must say a lot of things were also happening. The fourth is the fact that we then took act. And so our action then was based on all of those design. In fact, in Bring Back Our Girls for design, we designed an advocacy plan. And then we had our core values, we had all of those things that, matched or backed the designs that the tactical designs that we had done. So in terms of action, the fourth step was we then took action based on those designs that we had done. But we were not so fixated on those designs. We actually were flexible and we were adjusting as we kept going. The final part is then the sustainability. And then sustainability for us was then for us to say that it is important for us to not just act, but to sustain the action. So several people, whether as a group or individually, people were coming up with ways to just sustain the action. And then with that, what happens at the point, so sustainability continued, but what happens then is that if we are not careful with sustainability, it gets to a point where if we do not innovate, we will decline and go into extinction, so to speak. So at the level of that sustainability, we needed to advance. So we were taking on issues that connected to that particular Bring Back Our Girls. Issues around security and safety of schools, issues around the care for IDP, psychosocial support, advocating for other people who had been abducted and all of that, just so that we don't go into extinction. So right from gaining insight, futurizing, designing, acting, and then sustaining, those were the ways that we were able to sustain or were able to drive the Bring Back Our Girls movement. I'll close by saying that the biggest lesson for me in the course of this is the understanding that not just one straight-jacketed approach would yield the results that you want. It has to be a combination of effort, a combination of tactics. It's not just protest, it's not just indoor engagement. And it is also the recognition of the fact that there is a time for protest and there is a time for engagement. There is a time to step back. There is a time to move forward. And understanding the factors that determines each of those times is actually part of what strategic advocacy is about. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Buki. And thank you to all of our panelists from this part of our conversation. They've provided such a great and rich grounding in not only the current sort of struggles around SARS, but also the larger histories of activism and histories in general that allow us to understand this current moment. We heard from Baba Aye some comments about the really deep roots of class struggle and also young people's contributions to that struggle, and also taking us through the long 20th century into the present. From Ngozi, we also heard a really powerful set of comments that helped us understand histories of internationalism, women's role at the front lines, and really asking us to think about what has happened to the role of ideology and ideological vision in current struggles. And from Buki, we learned from the very recent past of Bring Back Our Girls, which many of you watching and listening are probably quite familiar with and may have been wondering how that translates into our current moment. And so let's all give a virtual clap for our first contributors to this conversation. And we are going to be transitioning now into more of an informal conversation, less of a presentation, but a conversation across all of our contributors today about how we think about Pan-African connections. How do we think about connections across movements throughout Nigeria's history? And on that note, I will pass it over to Tapia and Langdon, who will be taking the lead now.
Okay, unmuting myself first and foremost. Thank you so much to our panelists. So I was very struck by something you said, Ngozi, about how after decolonization, we simply replaced, one set of colonialists with another, and then this idea that movements today seem to not be tapping into that ideological notion of we need to pull down these structures of oppression which are tied to colonization. So to that experience and that history. So what would you say that current movements can learn from past movements in terms of how they were able to, you said you did a lot of research, a lot of reading, fact-finding, documenting, to be grounded in these ideologies? What would you suggest for people actively engaging in movements today?
Okay, thank you, Tabia. I think that already something is happening in that direction. I was talking about the kind of tools that are available today. I mean, it's amazing how you could just go on Google and you could read up. I was just sharing with my daughter this evening about what happened in Argentina under Galtieri and General Galtieri. And as I was talking about that, she went online and there she is, she's getting that information. So I think that there is a lot already of information that is easily available in terms of learning about what has happened in the past. And I also think that the world we're living in now is a little different from the world we lived in our time. I talked about the decline of visionary leadership. Hardly would you find world heroes, those personalities that, come out and they're very inspiring about, the future. So I think that is something that this generation would have to do. I think it's a historical responsibility. I mean, Frantz Fanon, I like something that Frantz Fanon said. These were the things that Babaye is nodding. They were things that were just a must for us. You had to read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That one you had to. You had to read Frantz Fanon. They just a number of them. He said that every generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. I think that the wave of protests we're seeing around the world now, and the fact that now you can be Pan-Africanist, you can be internationalist now without having to move from, one place to another geographically. I think that with this thing going on, this generation now has to do that visioning. I think humanity has gotten to the place where all the oppressive forces I think they themselves have run out of steam. They've run out of steam. They're just on the decline. And so we are seeing decay everywhere, even in places where we don't imagine that we will see some crudities and decay. And so we see things happening in, say, United States of America, things you will expect that people say happened only in third world countries, in quote. So that visioning, that new vision of a new world order, even the United Nations and the Committee of Nations, it was a moderating force. People subjected themselves to the United Nations. The UN doesn't have that kind of clout anymore, doesn't have that kind of international clout. Now, what's going to replace it? Because the UN came out of a historical experience. After the Second World War, we saw all the efforts to rebuild and create a new world order. Now, that world order that was created turned out to be unjust, as we all know. It became unequal. It did not favor our countries. Now, how are we going to create a new international world order? How are we going to create that new world? I think that is really something that's on the plate historically of this generation. I'm very optimistic person, but I want to say that if that task is betrayed, then I'm afraid that humanity is doomed. But I am a very, very positive person, and I can see all of what is going on around the world and all these movements that are coming up. Just that the movement has to advance the agenda, just has to put on the agenda that question of what world do we want to see, what type of society, and how do we begin to build it. I will end by saying that the NSAS people taught us something. They taught us how those barriers, those divisive barriers we had, ethnicity, religious divides, those things that politicians had used to divide people. We saw that. What Babaye also mentioned was a little bit of that element was in the fact for calling for better pay for the police. So I think that we have the tactics, and Buki also said something about engaging duty bearers, which I think it's important. How do we influence in our movements the supply side of governance? We focus more on the demand side, putting our demand forward, protesting. But how do we work within the supply side, within structure of duty bearers to begin to make change from within and change the governance culture from the supply side? So, thank you.
Thank you. Lengdun, do you want to?
I think we're having some connection issues, so if you want to continue.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Ngozi. That was really that point about the necessity of having visionary leadership. There's this quote that always comes to my mind. When MLK said the necessity for a radical revolution of values. It also ties into that, to my mind, especially here in Nigeria, in terms of what is needed. We had also planned to talk about how the anti-SARS and the current, government repression relate to what is happening in other parts of the world. And I was hoping that Babaye could tell us a bit about that. How is the anti-SARS movement related to protest movements around the world, and what is the potential, as Buki said, for this to springboard into real change? We tag this event from protest to movement, and then, as Buki rightly said, there's the need for the government structures to now also change in response to the protest. So what is the potential for that, given your vision of what has happened in the past internationally? Bye-bye. What would you say?
Thank you very much, Tabia. I would say it's when you look at when you talk of the waves of protests globally, a particular one stands out, the one in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. And it stands out for several reasons, because you had mass demonstrations in over 60 countries across all the regions of the world. You know, you've also had several mass movements, I mean, which are focused on particular issues in countries, Chile, and so on. But this was one that bound. And it's important to note that in each of these countries, whilst the movements were in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, they also addressed specific cases of racism and or police brutality. You know, in Canada, it was also along with the support for BLM, people call for justice for Regis Kuczynski. In Australia, people, you know, asked for justice for, I mean, David Dongay, who also was killed, an Aborigine who was killed in 2015, also saying he couldn't breathe by police. You know, in France, you know, in Germany, people shouted, you know, I mean, Germany, your hands too are not clean, to the elites there. What this shows is the centrality of policing to the domination of the exploited classes by the elites. And it also shows the interconnectedness of racism, and in countries within Africa, ethnicization of politics for the sustenance of capitalism. Like Malcolm X pointed it out, I mean, you can't have capitalism without racism. You know, so what this shows in terms of potentials, you know, is how you are having an internationalization of both perspectives and movements. Now, movement evolution takes several dimensions, because women and men change the world, but they don't change it they change it based on both the constraints and the facilitated aspects from what they inherited. And the world after 1989 changed a lot. You know, you had neoliberalism was the ideological project of the capitalist class globally from the late 70s. But after 1989, it had a swagger of capitalist triumphalism, of there is no alternative, to borrow from Margaret Thatcher. And this also kind of then informed the evolution of ideas challenging it. For example, when you had, after Seattle, you had an globalization movement in 1999, and the World Social Forum decided to see itself, which emerged from this, the social forum process, as more of anti-neoliberal spaces than a more programmatic, you know, fight back. And what all this means, because we are at a moment in history that is both promising, but with a lot of landmines emerging from, you know, decades of damage by neoliberal capitalism, ideologically, politically, and economically. And that is why even after the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, despite the fact that this recession showed that, look, neoliberalism in particular and capitalism in general are not sustainable. They cannot ensure a better world. They can only drag the world down into the abyss of catastrophe. Despite that, the bosses across the world manage to get away with feeding us the same concoction that led to the recession in the first place as the remedy, you know, for the terrible situation they put us in. Look at it. After 2009, you've actually had even greater cuts in funding of public services across the world. You've had the IMF's continued pushing of conditionalities that constrain the fiscal policy space of low and medium income countries. So the ideological battle is as essential, and it partly entails also our defining our goal. The movement is not everything, with the goal being nothing. We have to define our goal, and that goal has to be one of, overthrow of capitalism. Because look, the fact of the matter is this. Look even at the issue of climate change. Without doing away with the for-profit driven system, and which is essentially what capitalism is. I mean, we are all doomed. The world itself is doomed, not to talk of we as humankind on it. So the emerging movement is battling, is making a lot of inroads, but also battling to rise beyond just radical reforms. And I will wrap up here with an allegory I usually give, because I asked myself several questions in 2010, and by then it was obvious that, look, what we were going to get was more of neoliberalism. And I was like, the greatest of the worst economic situation for the poor across the world before the Great Recession was that in the wake of the Great Depression. But what came out of this? Well, there was also the World War and all that. But what came out of this? What came out of this was that the elites were eventually ready and did give concessions. They made social compromises. You had the New Deal in the United States of North America. You had the welfare state in Europe, and even the emergent countries in Asia, in Africa, and those that had earlier gotten independence in Latin America. The interventionist state ensured improved life for most people in terms of better healthcare, education, and all that. But after the Great Recession, things were not like that. Why? The answer was this. Look back. The fight back against the Great Depression was for a post-capitalist future. It was not just to negotiate for better chains of oppression. It was to break the chains. And that is why the elites were forced to make those concessions. Someone in the House of Lords in 1943 put it succinctly when he said, look, if we don't give them reforms, they will give us revolution. So I always say that, look, it's like if you were in hell and you are negotiating with the devil for a better place in hell. The devil knows you are not serious about leaving hell. But if you fight that, look, I'm leaving this hell, even if you don't succeed in leaving the hell, the devil will be able to say, oh boy, okay, come, I beg. I feel arrange a kind of air condition or fan for you in one corner of hell. We can't even get welfare. We can't reinstate the welfare state if we limit our demands to that. And our demands thus must be revolutionary, must be for total liberation, and must be one that we wage, through this period, both in defense of both to liberate ourselves as humans, and also to save the earth, within the context of the existential crisis of the climate change.
Thank you, Babai. Lengdung, I don't know if Lengdung is back. I know he was having some technical issues.
Yes, thank you,
Lengdung, are you
Tabia.
there?
I think I have a good network connection here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Lengdung. Go on.
Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
We can hear you.
We can hear you, Lengdung.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Sorry about that. I think we lost Lengdung. So I'll just move on to the next question. So building on what Baba Aye just said, it seems like we're in a time when there's the world to be won, and yet at the same time so many landmines. So I wanted to ask Buki now, based on your experience with Bring Back Our Girls and what you said about the advocacy cycle. I think there are a lot of lessons there, a lot of very interesting things, in terms of how movements are able to try to plan forward, a path forward, and meet goals, so that we avoid kind of like what Baba Aye alluded to, which is missing out on the opportunity for real change, because the reactionary elements in society, they're also strategizing and making sure that any gains we attempt are literally stopped. And we find what happened like in Egypt, for example, where after the Arab Spring, they found themselves, I won't say back to square one, but the outcome wasn't obviously what the movement expected or planned for. So I was just wondering if you could maybe speak a bit to that in terms of how the example you gave of the advocacy cycle can help, activists, people involved in movement building, to really try to have a clear vision of where it is they want to go, what it is they want to do.
Thank you. I think the first thing we must recognize is that, listening to Baba Aye, to be honest, I'm just really heartbroken. Heartbroken because our problem seems to have been the same. I've not spent too much here on earth as long as Baba Aye and Ngozi Iweala, because I hear some of the examples they gave, and I was asking myself, where was I? Was I in primary school or secondary school at that time? But it's sad that for young activists, you could literally plot a generational block of activism, of activists. And it seems as if there is a transference of problem from one point to the other, coming up in different shapes and sizes, coming up in different cloaks. And it doesn't seem as if, it may look as if we are not achieving much. But I can tell you that with what we saw with NSAS and that convergence, it tells you that if you're an activist and you think that whatever you're doing may not have been achieving much, then you should think twice. Because when there is a big revolution like that, it is not just the effect of that particular occurrence that is happening at that time. It is often a combination of events generationally that have led up to that point. And so I think I'm talking to myself and I'm saying it out that it may look as if we are not doing much, but we are actually doing much. What I think is a good way forward is we as activists and as the custodians of the change that we expect to see, not just in Nigeria, in the US or across the world, is for us to recognize the fact that as we keep demanding, the supply side keep changing their tactics to deafen their ears to the things that we're seeing. But beyond refusing to hear is also the refusal to not act. And so while the demand side keeps coming up with different demands based on the generational problems that we inherit, the supply side is not resting on its oars in terms of trying to respond in a particular way. The thing about protest is you get to a point where you protest, and they build some form of immunity around protests. Oh, they are coming again. And then they know the usual. And then the usual happens and everyone goes back home. And then you're wondering, have we achieved anything? But we must never underestimate the power of the little moves that we make and how they would eventually. What became of the first Black president in the United States was not the efforts that happened in that year. It was a accumulation of generational effort. That's the first thing. But most importantly is we must be able to introspect and understand that this generation or this phase or this period of trying to achieve change is not one that would achieve the change that we want to see based on the kind of tactics that we have used so far. What NSAS have taught us is that even the strategies of Bring Back Our Girls, Black Lives Matters, the Hong Kong protest and everything is not the same that they have chosen to adopt. And so situating that on the advocacy life cycle, you would recall that I said that even though we had our plan of action based on lessons, based on what we thought we should do, we were flexible enough to adjust to what realities was saying. And that flexibility helped us to take on a lot of new strategies in trying to achieve the goal that we want to. I hope that has answered your question.
So
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the responses so far. We're actually going to begin to transition now into comments and questions from our wonderful viewers. We've had quite an active chat that has been happening across platforms. And so there is one question, or there are several questions actually, but the first that we are going to start with is a question that is seeking more information from us. So Chinyere asked, what are some key books and articles to learn about Nigerian social movements? And, you know, in the spirit of Sunday school, if it seemed appropriate to provide some additional learning materials that people can look to. And I, in comments, suggested a book by Jega from 2000 called Identity Transformation and Identity Politics Under Structural Adjustment in Nigeria. It's a wonderful edited book that talks about SAP, which when Baba Aye talks about neoliberalism and what that did to radicalism in the entire world, it really offers an analysis of that. I also mentioned the work of Tijani, who has written quite a bit about labor unions and class struggle and the kinds of political education that were happening in labor unions, particularly in the mid-20th century. But perhaps other folks here have some suggestions for things that people can read to learn more about Nigerian social movements.
Yes, I would say there are quite a number of places to start. I mean, Edwin Madunago has written extensively on the problems of the socialist movement. It's a bit dated, 1980, but it's also been a consistent columnist ever since then till date. I would say, for me, understanding the economics of before now. Probably the most important work will be that by Escotoyo, Professor Esco's book on the economics of structural adjustment program, the prelude to globalization. I think it's a must read to understand how we got into the rut economically. I mean, the systemic nature of this, and looking at the aspects of ethnicization of politics, and I would look at people like Rauf Mustafa, as well as a number of articles. The Europe Review of African Political Economy has historically been a treasure trove of debates within the Nigerian left on social movement building, on political economy, and so on and so forth. Then the work 2 years ago by Adam Maya, Nigerian Marxisms, it will be very useful for identifying a host of not only Marxists, but radical minds and their works, both theoretical works and efforts in social movement building. Then Gambo Sawaba, it was written by Rima Shoalu. I think it's important for understanding I think one of the greatest women in our struggle, not only for independence, but after the independence period. Some others whom I think people need to read about in that direction will include Fumila Ransom Kuti, Fela's mother, and Margaret Ekpo, who led the Aba revolts that the colonialists like to describe as riots. Then Ta, forgotten the son, is, I would say, one of the leading Gramscian thinkers. He works with the Policy Institute, or at least used to. Then Professor Dong Pamsha is works on political economy are also quite useful in this regard. And then also I would suggest works of like John Beckman and YZ Yahoo. They actually worked on a project which brought together University of Stockholm and Bayero University Kano together, looking at different social movements in Nigeria. The women, and they did this in a collaborative manner. These were done with workshops, and so they did on women. There's one on women. They did on the trade unions. They did on the students' movement. The title of that was Great Nigerian Students. Although part of also the shortcomings of the workshop approach, like reading the Great Nigerian Students, I noticed that 3 speakers spoke on the same event, and they gave 3 different dates. One was even in a different year from the other 2, and I can say I have a good head for dates, and I can say actually the dates the 3 gave was actually incorrect. But if what you're wanting is a hands-on as an activist on this, not just necessarily for scholarly citations, those books by those collections, let me say, because books by Beckman himself and also YZ are of high academic standards, but those collections will be exceedingly useful for activists and scholar activists. I think, just a summary of things. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Baba Aye. The next question is for Sister Ngozi. The question was asked, in a post-colonial African context, what are the ways in which we promote the kinds of awareness and internationalism / Pan-Africanist awareness that seems to have been in decline since the 1990s? Sister Ngozi, would you like to answer that?
Thank you. Well, I think that, as I said earlier, one of the ways to promote that kind of awareness is the kind of conversations that we are having now. I think that we need to have more of those conversations, and we need to bring voices from different parts of, Africa to these conversations. One of the things that I've noticed, even with the lockdown and all this Zooming, is that we seem to be talking between us and, the northern countries, the global north, more than we are having conversations within the sub-region, within ourselves. So I think that this is one of the ways. The other thing is also trying to make connections with groups and organizations and movements that are on the ground to participate in solidarity with, these movements and struggles as they are going on, because that solidarity, it creates a kind of bond and an organic tie that then, has a dynamism of its own. So I would say that this, apart from, of course, Babaye just trying to look at what are the think tanks that we have in different parts of Africa intellectually, that we have, that we can have a kind of Pan-Africanist think tank that brings these think tanks together, to curate the knowledge, the information that we have there, and then think about how these things can be disseminated in a populist manner, because we need to democratize access to information, access to knowledge. I think that is one of the things that can help. I don't know if Babaye would like to chip in something to this.
Yeah, I'll chip in quite quickly. Thanks. I think some of the ongoing efforts, and which are quite useful. One, the series of Pan-Africanism and Socialism Today, which started in 2014. I think it's probably what has more successfully brought together a number of trade unions and social movements. It started with in Lusaka, and I think there have been 2 or 3 after that, in Ghana, and I think Tunisia, and it's brought back, a kind of spirit of a struggle. It partly emerged from the failed African Left Network some years back. So, and involvement, I think you have activists from like over 32 countries. Most of these being African countries, but also Africans from the diaspora, like the Brazilian MSK is very involved as well, and trade unions like NUMSA in South Africa. Unfortunately, I think part of it is that, like, because then I was in the trade union in Nigeria, and we raised it within the trade union movement, and that's part of the problem of the de-ideologization I mentioned. The Nigerian trade union movement bureaucracy at the time was not really so interested, but we have such, and I also think the Global African Worker Institute, which was launched at an historic meeting. I think that was 2 years back at the Unison Secretariat in the UK, and that was largely supported by the caucus of Black trade unionists in the United States. Although the focus was more on trade unionists, but it's also been successful in tying the threads. What I think is that there's also the need for these different efforts to utilize the opportunities where the opportunities also come with some disadvantages, including impact on our mental health. I'm talking of the zooming of everybody now. So, but to use this also in popularizing what is being done. I know that the Global African Worker is doing that with a series of webinars looking at issues as affect African and African descent workers across the world. They've heard on Latin America, on Africa, and yeah. So I think much more needs to be done, but there are efforts. We're not where we used to be. There are efforts against the stream, but these also need to be better spread and to be taken with much more. Yeah, but yeah, good things have been done. Thank you.
So for our next question, we have a comment that talks about militarism and also ethnicity. And so the question is from Jibo, and it says, is there any significant ethnic factor relative to the military in Nigeria? Obviously, we've talked, underlying the conversation has been militarism, but Buki, would you like to speak to how ethnicity intersects with militarism?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question. I think whether you will be able to, but in terms of, and I'm just going to make a short comment on that and hope one of the vital and skills to be able to provide better perspective. So in terms of ethnicity, what I've noticed, and I would go with not just the advocacy that I've done with Bring Back Our Girls, but several others, is how there is a point that we get to as a people that ethnicity plays, the lines of ethnicity is almost completely blurred or non-existent, such that we are no longer divided across whether you're Igbo, Yoruba, or Hausa. And I saw that greatly with the Bring Back Our Girls movement. But there are other movements that have led, for instance, such like the Church Me Too movement, where no one comes there thinking of ethnicity, and that is from the people's civilian part. However, I know this question is connected more to the intersection between ethnic factors and military in Nigeria, but I must say that I think I won't be able to do justice to it. If you permit me, I will push it to either Ngozi or Babai.
Oh, okay. I stayed back a bit because I believe even there was a lady asking the question, ladies first, and if Ngozi would have wanted to go at it. But and also taking note of that, we are behind schedule now. I just want to say that the Nigerian elite ethnicizes everything. If they could ethnicize the icons of religion, and you see ethno-religious politics, even with regards to the military, like in deployment, especially in the face of repression. I wrote something for the Socialism and Democracy Journal some years back on ethno-religious politics and the rise of Salafi jihadism in the north. But one key thing I drew from in that was from Yusuf Bala Yusuf, who pointed out that look, it's a game of mask. The ethnic factor in terms of the military, as in other aspects of life, is a game of mask played by the elite without realizing that look, what they are doing, actually they don't care because they don't think it will consume them, is exceedingly dangerous. It's exceedingly dangerous because irrespective of which ethnic group any soldier comes from, the rank and file are all oppressed as well. And you will see that amongst over 50 were sentenced to death some last year or 2 years back. I think it was commuted. And why? Because they mutinied. They mutinied because generals were going away with monies, I mean billions of naira that were meant for their upkeep and to get them with equipment and all that. And the officers doing this, they were not of just ethnic stock, so yeah, the ethnic factor is actually a fool's mate which the elite try to use to check the working class people across all ethnic groups. They are united within the military, outside the military, in fighting, rank and file soldiers as well as working class people, and trying to use the ethnic factor to divide us.
Great. Thank you, Baba Aye. I think that's so true. We don't have a ton of time, so we're going to try and combine some questions and streamline this just to be respectful of everyone's time. But the next question is for Ngozi Iweere, and it's more about like class divisions. And it was asked that if a radical vision of society requires elite groups to give up their privilege, how do you suggest people bridge the gap between grassroots and privileged groups who are interested in creating change? And so, Ngozi, please answer this if you're willing, and I'm sure we can also pass it to other panelists if necessary.
Okay, well, I've been doing a lot of work at the grassroots now, community organizing, and I think that it's very simple. The first thing starts from the mindset of the elites. I think the elite just sees itself as speaking on behalf of everybody and of the entire country. So the first thing is for the elite to accept that it's not representative of everybody, but it's representative of a certain class interest. So that consciousness should be there. The other thing is to respect the fact that every citizen has equal rights, and that the fact that people don't have formal education doesn't mean that they don't know what their problems are or their conditions or how those problems might be solved. So it means bringing grassroots voices to the table where decisions are being made. You hear a lot of, when people are planning actions, you hear people saying community outreach. And I'm saying you don't outreach to anybody. Why are you outreaching to somebody? They should come on board and be on the table with you where the decisions are being made. So I think that the communities that can speak for ourselves, people are organized and there are many places where we can reach them. Our economy is informal, especially in this country, and I think in other parts of Africa, we have a large informal sector. And I think that informal sector, if you went in there, you'll find that people do have their own organizations that we need to recognize and bring those community leaders to the places where we are planning how to bring about social change. I think it's just simple. It's bringing people to the decision-making table and not make the decisions and then go and outreach, to them with the decisions we have made.
Can I just quickly add something to that, to say that, while we bring people together, one thing I have also noticed working in the grassroots is the gap in knowledge, and how when people do not know, there is the tendency that they are unable to connect on certain issues or certain demands. And so because of the way we are wired as Africans, where we believe that making demands is being disrespectful. I recall how during the Bring Back Our Girls, I lost a lot of friends, and I'm sure some of us here would have also had that experience, because people just believe that demanding accountability is a way of being disrespectful to your elders. And then it becomes a bit more difficult when people bring religion into it, and they explain things within the context of Christian or Muslim. Aisha Yusufu was sharing with me how she faced a lot of backlash when that picture went viral, from particularly members of the Muslim community would think that women like her, hijab wearing and everything, should not be that radical in demanding and expressing their views, because it is considered disrespectful, it is considered haram. And the same thing with the Christian folks as well. So I think one way to close that gap is to, enlighten people, open the eyes of people through knowledge. Let them understand what rights mean. Let them understand what fundamental freedom is. Let them understand, basic things, basic constitution. Let them be able to know that if we are demanding that there should be end to police brutality, we are simply demanding for the protection of our Section 33 right in Nigeria, which is basically the right to life. So I think if people can know, it also helps in closing that gap between those that they believe that, and we must deconstruct or redefine what we mean by elite. Elite, what elite means to some people in the grassroots community is not defined by your economic power or anything. So long as you are educated alone, you are considered to be in a block of elitism, and so many of those categorizations. And for these different ideologies of what elitism is, they require different approaches in trying to close the gap so that we can bring them on the table to achieve change.
But very quickly, I'll be very quick. I just want to, talk of, privileged or elite, but when we now also put it with as groups, and you're talking of these being interested in creating change, I think there's a need for activists to be careful of this, drawing from our recent experiences also. You had groups of elites that joined the 2012 uprising only to use it to rise to power, claiming to be coming with change in 2015. They are the people that now make up the APC. So it is possible for some elites as individuals, and that's why I feel more comfortable with, calling the spade a spade. I mean, the issue of classes, I mean, because the class struggle is still central to what is at stake. Members of, the elite class, as individuals could commit class suicide, but as a group, talking of bridging, it's like trying to bridge oil and water. But what I think can serve as a plank for bringing, all working class people and those middle class, and is program, is clearly defining what does changing the system entail. And this is not something that should either just come from some wise man's head or whatever. Yes, there should be contestation of ideas. Let 100 flowers blossom in this process. But it has to be about a program for total liberation, a program for systemic change. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So we are preparing to close. And as we close, I just wanted to highlight a few comments and questions, and then we're going to invite each person here to close with just 1 minute so that we can end on time. And then we'll let you know about our upcoming sessions of the Pan-African Activist Sunday School. So we had a comment/question that talks about how Black Lives Matter has taught us that leadership is overrated. And I think this is related to the point Baba Aye was just making. The person continues, Chinyere continues, remember, they've killed many of our leaders, both in the USA and in Africa. Nkrumah, Lumumba, decentralization is how the US BLM movement has gained strength. We also had a comment that said, Keziah said she would love to see more cross-cultural exchanges like this that are student-centered, and that this would go a long way in bridging the gaps that too often exist among Black students from different cultural backgrounds. We also had a person who requested, let's see here. They asked that we actually create a book list that we could maybe post, since so many of us had great suggestions for reading material. So perhaps that is something that we could also do. And then we had a comment about ideology and why ideology and politics don't seem to coexist as frequently as they should. Let's see, and I think these are the primary comments and questions, but we now would like to invite each of our contributors to close us out with some final remarks, and we'll just have 1 minute for each person. So how about we start with Tabia, actually.
Okay. So thank you, everyone, for this wonderful session. I think, to me, something I just want to invite everyone to do, because we've all been talking about reading lists and getting more ideologically informed. I think that's really very important. I personally, one thing that's really inspired me is the Black radical tradition. And just to point out very quickly, people say a lot about what it means to be a radical. Radical in its origin really means you want to get to the roots of things. You want to understand systems. You want to understand why things are the way they are. People paint the status quo as inevitable. They'll tell you women must be oppressed, people are poor because that's just the way it is. It's not. There are systems and reasons that benefit a certain class of people and keep the rest of society down. And I think it's up to all of us, in as much as we can. There are so many short videos or books, or depending on how deep you want to go and the time you have. But it's important to do that work of basically investigating all of these systems and realizing that all of us contribute in one way or another, even without us knowing it, whether as women of a certain class in society, or simply as men. We all contribute to the oppression of another group, and it's up to us to investigate how that is and to decide what role we're going to play in basically making sure that that oppression no longer ceases to exist, or ceases to exist rather.
Thank you, Tavia, for that call to action. Let's hear from someone we haven't heard from at all today, Tunde.
Yeah, thanks. So I think this has been a great panel, a great discussion, rather. I really enjoyed hearing from all of the speakers. I wanted to inject some words about imperialism. I think, we touched on it with the structural adjustment programs, but I think, we could actually attribute a lot of, the worsening economic conditions, the political alienation, and some of the other underlying issues that have driven protests and this SARS movement to decades of Western neocolonialism and imperialism and an unsustainable global economy. I think it's these police forces that I guess are the SARS police unit is really shielding a conquistador class in Nigeria. Like Baba Aye really spoke to that well. I think we need to recognize that class also serves Western interests, and so I just want us to be cognizant of the broader structure. That's not to say that I'm calling for more Western involvement or like any sort of increased Western influence. I'm actually calling for like the U.S., Britain, France, all of those Western powers to leave Africa, right? Like we know that AFRICOM trains the Nigerian military. We know that the UK, they trained Nigerian police. That they also, I think, were involved in training the military as well. So I want us to be cognizant of that aspect. But yeah, that's all I really wanted to add.
Thank you, Tunde. Let's hear from Baba Aye.
Well, I would want to round up with a quick response to the take on leadership being overrated. I don't think it's correct. I think the correct thing is that iconic leadership, the big man, big woman leadership is overrated. Leadership essentially boils down to providing education and direction through struggle. Each and every one of us, down to the grassroots, is and should be a leader. In your communities, in your union, as a rank and file, you should provide leaders. We should forget the Superman, Superwoman perspective of leadership to bring about a new world, a better world, breaking the shackles from the past. We all need to seize, the horns of history by its horns, and seize history, the bull of history by its horns, and forge ahead. So that will be my final take, that it all rests with each and every one of us to build the movement for the revolutionary change we seek.
Thank you. Let's hear from Buki.
So my final comment will be that to remind us that 112 Chibok girls are still missing. They are yet to be brought back. It's been 6.5 years. A lot has been said about activism, advocacy, and there's no point overflogging it. But just to say that these girls are still missing. Leah Sharibu is still missing. Alice Ngada is still missing. And these are the names and the faces that we know. There are several others that were never profiled that are still missing. And so if you ever raise your voices for these people, please don't relent, please don't stop, because our humanity is not complete if we are not consistent in our demand. And our humanity is tied to the old concept of Ubuntu that we hear in South Africa, that I am who I am because of who we all are. And so those girls never demanded for what became of them on April 14, 2014. And until we have them back and several others, then indeed the display of our humanity is incomplete. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm sure there are people watching who were not aware that there are still over 100 girls who are still missing. And so we need to continue to emphasize, bring back our girls. So let's turn it over to Ngozi.
Well, I'm going to use my last minute to thank Nari and Crystal for putting this together, and my co-panelists, and to say, reiterate what I said earlier, that we need to have more and more of this kind of conversations. And lastly, I think for everyone out there that's involved in movements and trying to bring about social justice and make change, that we spend a lot of time doing the collective visioning of the kind of world that we want to see, the kind of society we want to see, the kind of countries we want to see. There is so much emphasis on what is wrong and what we're doing right and what we want to change. But I think that we need to also pay so much attention to what we want, the alternative. What do we want to replace this? So that hope, that aspirational, forward-looking, recreating of our world and our realities, it's what I really would want to leave us with. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of our wonderful panelists. I want to think that, Nanre, you and I should also have a final word. Would you like to go first?
Yes. So it's really been an amazing time, and I think it's been a very difficult year for me personally. Just organizing, being on the streets, and then just seeing a constant replay of so many things happening here in the U.S., in Nigeria, my other home. I have two homes. And just really realizing, the connectivity of the events, but also the connectivity of the struggle. And also, across generations, I came back to Nigeria after being schooled in the US. And, I met so many of these amazing people and read their work and just really knowing about the struggle, but that the struggle continues. And so just very grateful for everyone for being in this space. This is the beginning of a conversation and hopefully the beginning of a larger movement where we can continue to work together, to mobilize, to learn from each other, and really build, like Ngozi said, the society that we imagine, where our humanity can be embraced, not just by the rest of the world, but also by ourselves.
Thank you for those words. And I will just say a word of encouragement, which is that in as much as this conversation has been very much focused on what is happening in Nigeria, it is important to recognize that Black people, African people all around the world are rising up in power as we speak, right? We have seen in the past decade alone, at least 30 African countries have movements and struggles for regime change. We have seen in the United States in the past months an unprecedented level of struggle, right, around policing, around a fundamental abolitionist vision for change, right? And so we do ourselves no favor by keeping ourselves disunited. We do ourselves no favor by not making connections across our struggle. And that is very much the spirit of the Pan-African Activist Sunday School, which is that there is strength in our unity. It is our actual duty to learn from one another, to share our resources, to engage and sustain a conversation, but more than that, to struggle together and to struggle for a world that, like our sister Ngozi said earlier, that has a transformative and radical vision for our communities. And so we hope that you will join us here next Sunday, where we will move across the ocean to the United States and talk about the Black radical tradition in the United States, and specifically really digging more deeply into the struggle around police abolition here in the United States. So thank you all for joining us. We hope that you will continue to share the broadcast that you watched today. It is archived on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, and we hope we'll see you we'll see you right back here this time next week. Thank you once again to all of our panelists and to all of you for joining us.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
All right.